Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. And this week, joining us from Denmark is Carsten Lützen. Hi, Carsten. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you.
Absolutely. So Carsten is an agile coach at the Lego Group. Before that, a Scrum Master for different teams. He has a deep love of graphical facilitation and professional coaching. Besides his full-time job, he shares weekly tips on YouTube and LinkedIn on agile, facilitation, and coaching. And as usual, we'll put the link to all of those on the show notes. So Carsten, that was a short intro to you. So please take a minute. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
So to figure out how I ended up becoming a Scrum Master, we actually need to go way back in time. So when I finished high school, I was unsure if I should study some IT-related stuff or history. And to be honest, I had no clue. But then by chance, I got an offer as a trainee developer or junior developer at a big newspaper. And then because I was unsure, could I actually sit still 8 hours a day in front of a computer, or would I need something where I could move around and talk to a lot of people? But to be honest, I loved it. I loved just sitting and developing, and I learned so much. But I could also slowly see that I like the people side of it and this structured way of it. And then I started to study computer science after a couple of years, and there I got introduced to software processes and design and stuff like that. And that really kickstarted my fascination of Scrum, for instance, and this way of viewing stuff. Then after my computer science, master in computer science, I got a job at the Lego Group, starting out as a developer, but quite soon actually, because it was a newly formed team. We had nothing, no old code we had to support. We should build everything ourselves and then support that, so we could do whatever we wanted. And then slowly we actually started to see, okay, we need somebody to take care of this facilitation part of it and help on the process side. And then I stepped in, and that was kind of the start of my Scrum Master journey. And that's actually
it. That's a great story. Also highlights one of the things that many of our listeners for sure have felt in their own career, is that at some point when things are working well enough, you start to see that the problems are not really the actual coding and testing, but they are understanding the requirements, talking to stakeholders, understanding why certain things work for you but don't work for the customer, like all of that, as you called it, people side. I don't know if you're going to talk about the people side, but today's Monday, so we're going to talk about a fail story, right? It's Fail Monday here on the podcast. And we want you to tell us a story of a moment where you as a Scrum Master, you did your best, but at that time, as it happens to all of us, the best just wasn't good enough. So tell us that story, Carsten.
So I really like this part about failure, because to be honest, I've had a lot of failures, but I think one of the failures I still think back on is when I was a rather new Scrum Master. We had a big deadline for a system that had to be delivered, and we were really doing our best. We were working overtime because we had this deadline. We were really giving all we could, and we could see we could not finish the sprint. So we sat and talked with the product owner, and we agreed maybe it was actually a great idea if we just prolonged the sprint. So instead of keeping the cadence, just one more week, then everything would be done right, and we could mark everything. In theory, that was a great idea. In reality, it messed up so many things. So, of course, after that extra week had ended, we had not finished everything as we naively had hoped to do. Secondly, we had ruined this stable cadence with when do we have our retrospective, when do we have our planning, when do we do all this kind of stuff. And it actually took us quite a lot of time to get back into the rhythm. And all of this was just done because we really thought, and I really thought, this is a great idea. Just one more week and everything will be peachy. So that was the first and last time I prolonged a sprint. It was definitely not worth it.
So I'm sure that right now, at this very moment, as people are listening to this podcast, somebody in the team of a listener or several is exactly suggesting that idea. And they are probably convinced, as much as you were back then, that, this is really a great idea because, we don't need to interrupt the work, we get this done, and, all of those arguments that you've heard before. What advice would you have for that person or that team that is right now considering whether they should prolong their sprint?
Don't do it! ! Because I did not value the stable cadence before that, to be honest. It was just, then we have every second week a meeting where we do planning, right? But actually knowing that it was exactly that week and everything was apparently, we did not notice, we did not think about it before, synced to that. So the stakeholders knew when to expect it, but all of a sudden we got out of sync. And the question, should we then have 1 week sprint that we could try to plan to the best of our ability, or should we then just move everything? So instead of ending sprints in even weeks, then it would be uneven week numbers and stuff like that. It was a world of pain for some time until we got back, and it took longer to build it back again. And I still understand all these. If we do it, if we just prolong the sprint, this and this will happen. But I also know that no, it won't. It will hurt. So don't do it.
So one of the things that immediately comes to mind, and you mentioned it already, is this idea of the wishful thinking, right? So I know it's just 3 days. Come on. It's just 3 days. Come on, I can get it done. Right. And of course, it isn't just 3 days. And very often, in the old days of project management, we used to have this phrase, my project is 90% done. I hope the second half goes as well as the first half.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And this happens all the time. It happens on a sprint level as well. And then the other thing, and that was for me the biggest takeaway from this story, is that unbeknownst to us, without us ever noticing it, there's a lot of rhythms that develop on the cadence of Scrum, right?
Exactly.
So if you have a random rhythm, like you never know when you're planning, you never know when you're having the retrospective, you never know when you're releasing. If it's random, then those rhythms don't develop, right? And then you have even bigger problems because you need to interrupt everyone to synchronize. Right? Like the stakeholders will come in with a huge project that is so important and everything needs to stop. And, the previous huge project that was so important needs to be stopped for the new project to be started, right? That happened a lot of times, especially in waterfall environments. But because this cadence develops these other invisible dependencies, when we break it, we're actually breaking somebody else's cadence.
Exactly.
Right? You mentioned stakeholders, but it's very easy for us to think about other teams that depend on us. The operations team, maybe the security team that reviews our release before it goes live, had time allocated to review the release, but because now we don't have a release to give them, they need to move on to other things, and it's only 2 weeks. It's at least 2 weeks before they can give us any time. And that means we now have a sprint of 4 weeks instead of 2, and so on and so forth. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway, that there are other rhythms, other cycles around us that develop to take advantage of the cycle and the cadence we've created. And when we break it, we break those other cycles and we affect those other teams. That was the biggest takeaway for me. How about you, Carsten? What would you like the listeners to take as the biggest takeaway?
So the biggest takeaway, if you're curious, right, try to prolong your sprint and see what other things break. Then you know who is actually dependent on you. But on a serious note, don't do it. So my biggest takeaway was never to prolong a sprint again. Then rather show whatever was done at the sprint review. Go through that, figure out, so what do we need to prioritize to meet that deadline in a week or whatever, and then do that instead, and then plan the best of our ability the next sprint, even though that we can probably only see half into it. Then do that. It's much better to keep the rhythm.
It's much better to keep the rhythm, indeed. Thank you for that, Carsten.
You're welcome.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests help their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.